I'm Steve Hamilton, the Dean of the Graduate School of Education here, and I'm going to be the moderator of the panel with the people you've already met. I'm going to try to moderate this panel, but it's a very immoderate panel. Thank you. When Adria and I were classmates at Swarthmore, she was the political activist, and my activity was educational. I was involved in Upward Bound, and I decided when I was in college that I was going to go in education as a means of pursuing my commitment to equity. Unlike Adria, I knew what I was going to do when I graduated. But at this point in my career, I'm feeling more than a little chagrined that, according to the evidence, education has not only failed to make our society more equal, we've become less equal, but it has become a means of further stratifying our society. That is to say, privileged families are able to make sure that they pass on their privilege through education by making sure that their kids get a better education than other people's kids. That's what's happening at a macro level. One of the reasons I'm happy to be here at the school that was created by my graduate school classmate, Rob, and my friend Larry, whom I met in the School to Work movement, is that they are one of the schools that is a countervailing tendency to that. That is a school that is succeeding in educating all students to a high level. Elliot is another one of those. I visited his Met school some years ago, and no, it couldn't have been that one. It was at 20. Anyway, there are some bright spots that are very encouraging. And I believe that's a major motivation for all of us, most of us in this room, is to learn how to do a better job of educating all students. And I wanted to begin the panel by asking each one of the members to tell a story about how that has happened, how barriers have been identified and overcome on the way to making it possible for all students to get a good education. Let me start on the right with Rob.
Well, thank you, Steve. I'm really delighted to be the first speaker here. Well, there's probably a lot. I'm going to be grabbing the mic from people as they're talking later, so I'll try to be brief. Right now, I want to think about I want to just say one thing. That very early on in my career, first of all, I went to Morocco and taught there for a couple of years in a small village, and in an Islamic culture, and learned to appreciate that culture in ways that transformed me, and I was never the same afterwards. So I came back to this country feeling like I was a stranger in my own land, and I still feel that way. And then I went south to Birmingham, Alabama to teach in a black college there in 1967-68. That also changed me because it raised my consciousness about what was going on in this country and led me to realize that it wasn't just the South. As Malcolm X said, you're south of the border, you're south. And that gave me a sense of where I wanted to go and where I wanted to be working. And just one little, so I ended up working in a little alternative public school. I was in a doctoral program by that time. Steve was doing a study there. We were both doing study there, but I was working in it. And it was a school where we knew that anyone in that environment who was affected by a decision had the right to participate in the decision, and where we wanted to celebrate diversity, and where we wanted to reconfigure the relationships between adults and kids in schools. Wanted to shake that up. So in that school, we had students holding the balance of power. This was a public school inside a school. And it was started by some graduate students, of whom I was one, and some Cambridge teachers. Students held the balance of power on the hiring committee to hire teachers in that school, in a public school. And we managed to figure out, we were all young at the time, those of us who were the adults, were trying to figure out how to be adults in that school. And sometimes that wasn't so easy. The school was like, it looked like chaos, and it was chaos at times. It took us a while to get our footing. But what we discovered was that the way to change the authority relationships between kids and the adults, you know, the usual authority relationship in a school is, I'm the teacher, I've studied this subject, I know more than you, I'm older than you, and I'm getting paid to do this. That's the basis for authority, right, in most of our schools. And those things are there. They're there in the environment. But it's not the authentic basis for authority. The authentic basis is that we have a common purpose. And as the teacher, I am the custodian of that purpose. So that's what we were learning to do way back then, in those early days, was to share authority with kids around important decisions about who teaches here and what we learn. And that's what I've tried to be working on ever since, because I knew from experiencing it that it could work. And I knew also that it was very rare. And I even saw, as some of the practices in that school got chipped away as the system moved in to it. There's this regression to the default. So I don't know, I better stop there. But just a notion that kids respond when they are invited to participate in determining their future, in saying who we are as a community, who I am, who we are, and where we're headed. They respond. And I think we need more of that. I think we need to blow up the schedule, change the teacher, engage in collegial pedagogy, and do assessment as dialogue. You've been here all day, right? You've been here learning all day. How would you like to be assessed? I'm serious. How would you like your learning today to be assessed? Well, one thing you would want to say was, well, let's talk about how good the sessions were. It's not just about what I learned from the session, it was about whether the session was any good. So we need to think about those authority relationships, the collegial pedagogy. We need to think about experience as the text, which all your students are getting engaged in. That's the text that gives them standing in the classroom, if we're talking about equity. And we need to think about assessment as dialogue. Those are just three things I wanted to say. I got that off my chest, and I'll pass it along to somebody else.
Okay. I'm going to stand up because I'm Larry from High Tech High. So, hi everybody. Great. I love teachers, and it's a real honor and pleasure to have you here. To answer Steve's question about equity and issues, especially for those of us who have the special, I was a carpentry teacher for 15 years in inner city high schools, in this space, early in August, we had all 760 of our faculty and people who work at High Tech High. And when I just welcomed people, there were other people who were running the show, and I stepped off the stage and I saw Brent. Where's Brent over here? By the way, it's very easy to run into Brent in a crowd. And I saw Brent, and a young teacher said to me, who's Ted Sizer? I guess I'd mentioned Ted Sizer in my 2 minutes, and some of you might not know him. But you're about to find out about him. And I ran into Brent and I said, do you still have that video from when Rob and I interviewed Ted right before he passed away. Ted was a phenomenal educator. He was dean at Harvard. He was 31 years old. He passed when he was 78, I believe, and had a great career in several roles in education. And I said, "Do you saw the video?" And he said, "I don't know." And 2 hours later, he emailed it to me, and I looked at it again. When we met with Ted, I asked Ted, "What was the moment in your life that you first started to think differently about this question of equity and intelligence and who can do what and who can't?" And he talked about when he was in the military. After college, he was in the military at Fort Devens in Massachusetts, and they had to shoot ordnance into a bullseye, which is pure math to calculate how it goes. And there was this working class kid next to him who couldn't do the math, and every single piece of ordnance he shot went in the bucket. And then Ted said, that made me start to realize that I have to really think about intelligence differently. And it started to make me realize that the more narrowly we define intelligence, the more broadly we've defined what's not intelligent. And the more narrowly we define what is motivational for a learner, the more broadly we've defined what is not motivational for a learner. And that was a gift for me. What else happened to me was, relatedly, while I was teaching physics in Cambridge, it's an, excuse me, Freudian slip, my son's doing physics in Cambridge. When I was teaching carpentry in the high school in Cambridge, someone named Tom Sue, who was at MIT, wanted to create something called the Cambridge Physics Outlet, in which my carpentry kids were making out of wood physics equipment, like shooting things and doing all that math. And our kids were making it, and he created a little enterprise about it. But the peak moment, in terms of your very good question about equity, was that the state of Massachusetts gave out these grants called Commonwealth In-Service Grants, and the people who teach physics tend to be of a higher socioeconomic status than the people who teach carpentry, typically, et cetera. There are those we know those variations within the teaching craft that we all do. We got money from the state of Massachusetts, and we had working class kids teaching middle-class physics teachers how to use the equipment. That was a moment when I really thought that we were really turning this thing around in the way that Ted said to me. So the biggest risk for us all is when we attempt to assess, because it's not an assessment, it's a prediction. And it's not even a prediction, it's a misprediction. And that's what we need to be careful about most in this work, so as to be equitable. So for High Tech High, much as we're interested in equity, much as we're interested in pedagogy, which we really clearly are, we try to have always above it matters of equity and not mispredicting who can and who can't do what, because we're surrounded in a society that's very good at that, and we don't want to be good at mispredicting. That's my 2 cents.
Well, I'm definitely not going to try to wander into what Larry and Rob have said very eloquently about pedagogy and philosophy and all of that. And
Wait a minute. Let me say something here.
What?
I just want to say, despite Adria's disclaimers, virtually everything I know about curriculum and teaching and learning comes from Adria. Let's just get that settled right now.
And we worked together for years. We taught together at Harvard for years. She worked with me in the high school for years in Cambridge. The rest of us are the performing monkeys, okay? This is the brain behind all of it, okay?
I'm almost speechless, but the only thing I'm going to add is much more on a structural level, because it's true. My first love was curriculum and pedagogy, and I did a lot of thinking about hands and minds and knowing and doing and all those, double words, rigor and relevance. I mean, we had all of it. But what I wanted to say was, in the last 20 years that I've been at Jobs for the Future, my work has much more been at a systemic and structural and policy level. And I do think, when I think about the problem that you started us with, that it does take change in the structures as well. And, for me, one really good example of that is the early college high school. That, we started to realize at a certain point that the college door was really closed to a lot of young people. And as we know, it's still It still is. And as we saw in the graphs this morning from Randy, even when the door gets pried open a little bit, low-income young people don't get through to the other end of college. But so the idea of early college, high school was, okay, well, what happens if you start really mixing up the high school and post-secondary, instead of it being these completely separate institutions, if you actually let young people start to experience college, not just set up gates saying you can't come in all the time, but actually start having them experience it while they're in high school. Does that change their perception of themselves, of what, of their own abilities, that they could be a college student? Does it actually also change their ability to get through some of those gates that still are going to be there as they, as they get into the college? So those kinds of structural things, and School to Work was the same thing, was, could we start to mix up the story here so it's not just a bunch of schools sitting off by themselves making rules for young people, but that you start to have other institutions playing a role with them. So, schools and workplaces, secondary and post-secondary. So some of these kinds of structural moves, I think, to get at it in the society are going to be very important. An early college had a little peak about 10 years ago, and then it looked like maybe it was going to go away. And now suddenly a lot of states are rediscovering early college. And it's, the ninth, we might call it 9 through 14 pathways or whatever, but it's an idea, another one of those ideas that because it does address the equity issue very directly in our society, because college has become the dividing line of our classes in many ways, I think it's an idea that's going to be around with us and very much worth paying attention to, but very, very hard to do, to break down those barriers between the secondary and post-secondary education.
You're on, Elliot.
Okay, well, I'll say a few things. So I guess I'll start with saying that schools are still not very user-friendly places for students. And that's a barrier. There's another barrier, which is even though students choose to go to a school or families choose to send their children to a school, many, many times the school doesn't fit the other side of that compact, which is the word fit, that the school fits the student across race, class, gender, and personality. We assume way too often around when somebody comes up with a kind of a new finding around post-traumatic stress, that every student who comes from a certain place is experiencing that, when different personalities of students under the same conditions and circumstances actually respond very, very differently to the situation. And it builds resilience as well. And so you have to look at each and every student. That's why we do the work that we do, focused around one student at a time in a community. And when you start looking at the interests of each and every student, that changes things. And right now that's a barrier, because the lowest common denominator of most schools is a class for a teacher, not a student. So fit is important. Mattering is important. What matters to each and every student? Nobody really asks them. You assume a content over here, and as Rob was saying earlier, and I'll say it my way, it's not our work to teach the content and have students forget it 6 months later. I went into a big state meeting and they were all concerned about the content, and I said, well, don't issue the diploma until 6 months later, which is what Ted Sizer told me. He says, and if they pass the test, then issue the diploma. And then they all shut up, because they know that it's just about accountability, not being account-able, but accountability. They did it now and they can forget it later. Well, if they do it in a situated learning environment outside of school and inside of school, at internships in multiple places, all of a sudden, you can see what sticks and what doesn't. So what matters to you will stick. And if somebody asks students what matters to them, that goes a long way. That's a barrier. Rules and regulations at school is a barrier. There's more rules and regulations in a school, believe it or not, studies show, than if you're incarcerated or a Marine in military boot camp. At least you can go to the bathroom without asking permission. And you don't have to go through a metal detector on your way into school and stand out in the rain when at 3:30 in the afternoon, everybody's walking in and outside of school. They take away the metal detectors. It's just a rule and a regulation. It's not real. So the last one around barriers is unrecognized talents and interests of each and every student. That's not where we start. We start once again with the content. It's how you use the content that matters, how students use the content, the pieces that they use. And so when you look at all those different pieces and you look at issues of equity across race, class, and gender, you also have to look at each and every student and see how they fit, what matters to them, what their interests are, and how we deregulate schools, especially, and I travel all over the world, and California is one of these places where they don't relax until they have a rule or a regulation around stuff. It's part of the culture here. And that is a serious barrier. Unless you're the kind of staff person in your school or a school leader, which I'll talk about tomorrow, that figures out how to do that work in a way where nobody really does kind of check up on that stuff. They really don't care how you do what you do. All right, that's really up to you. So you have a lot of freedom, and you have 24 hours in the day if students are engaged around what they're doing, both in and out of school. We assume that the only place they're learning, we, collective we of schools, that the only time they learn something is in school. Well, where'd you learn how to read? On your grandmother's lap or in school? And where'd you learn how to do that math problem? And I would argue that person who was good at munitions actually is good at math. Just looks at math very, very differently. That's field mathematics and field mathematics, having a sense and feel for the world. That's an artistic way of doing it, as well as a scientific way. And that's very cognitive and that's very intellectual. We just don't want to measure it because it's not easy to measure. So we only measure stuff that's easy. And that's a barrier, and that gets in the way as well. And I'll stop where everybody else stopped on assessment. When I work with people all over the world, we all kind of come to the same conclusion around the most powerful form of assessment is self-assessment. Biologically and neurologically, we can't stop self-assessing. We got to get across the street with figuring out how to do it without getting killed or hurt. And yet, how often do we ask in schools, how do you think you did? And if it matters to a student, they're going to tell you, I got to read these 3 books, I got to meet these 4 people, I got to practice and practice for 6 hours a day every day around getting that work right. So self-assessment is important. It's something that everybody can do. Everybody can ask what you're interested in. And everybody can look at each and every child as who they are. Not just across race, class, and gender, but also who they are. You know, my latest blog is, and if you know this marshmallow test, because there's another one of these things that come out. How many people know that marshmallow? My latest blog is true. I ate the marshmallow, and I kept on eating it. All right? Yeah, I'm an impulsive kind of person, but I'm not dead. All right? I learned how to deal with my impulsivity.
Well, sometimes.
Well, yeah, sometimes it gets me in trouble, and sometimes it actually saves my life. You know, because gut reactions are very, very important. What do we want to do? Do we want to make every child passive, complacent, do well on a test that they may not want to do well on because we only give one test? So I'll stop there. Those are barriers. Rob, go ahead.
I just want to pick up on the barriers a little bit, and particularly on the rules and regulations. And this is a story. Years ago, I became for a while the language arts coordinator, K-12, in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the first thing I did, I had the high school, we had 25 English teachers in the high school. And I brought them away to a room at Harvard. The school was located 3 or 4 blocks from Harvard. Brought them away in groups of 5 teachers for a whole day to talk about our work. And the first question was, what are you doing that you think your kids are really engaged in and that you're pretty engaged in? And of the 25 teachers, 24 of them talked about projects that they were doing with kids. One teacher talked about a new way she had figured out to do vocabulary tests on Friday. But 24 of them spoke about, and it's a traditional high school. 24 of them talked about projects. And I said, so if this is the important work and the rewarding work, why aren't we doing more of it? And they said, they won't let us. And I said, wait a minute. I'm they. I'm telling you, you can do this work. And they didn't, in the end. So this raises the question for me, of the barriers that we encounter, how many of them are real and how many of them are inside us? How many of them are ones that we have created? Sometimes it's a little easier to keep doing what we're doing and talk about what they won't let us do because we're kind of used to doing what we're doing, and that's what we're comfortable with. But I just think that really needs to be teased out of the barriers that are in the way of doing this kind of life-changing work with kids. Which ones are the real barriers, and which are the ones that we have kind of constructed or been complicit in ourselves?
Larry has suggested that we turn the questioning over to the audience. I could ask more questions, but
Give me a mic. I don't know. I'm only kidding. Where's Randy? Yeah, he got a microphone out there. Yeah.
questions from the audience.
I got a question. Can I just holler really loud? Is that okay?
How do we answer it?
We've been sent here as ambassadors from our schools to take this back and apply it. And there are people in our schools that don't know about it, about this approach. And it's hard for us to show it. It's hard for us to learn it ourselves. And not only that, there's a lot of people that are actively against this approach because they are comfortable doing what they're doing. What do you suggest we do when 30, 40% of the school is on board and 60, 70% is not?
That's Larry.
I know what that's, I know what that's like, okay? Very, very much so. Here's what worked for us back in Cambridge, okay? When we were in that cohort that you're talking about, we said to everybody else, we have 2 ground rules, okay? Some of us want to do something, and not everybody else has to do it. That's ground rule number 1. But ground rule number 2 is those people who don't want to do it, while they don't have to do it, are not going to be allowed to stop those of us who do want to do it from doing it. That's a very fair shakeout to present, and that worked for us. So give yourself space and let the horses at the gate run and keep them running. And then what we found is then other people slowly started to join in, and I think it's fair.
Another piece of the answer, I think, to your question is what Rob just said before. I mean, if you can just ask a simple question to people like what your most memorable learning experiences were for you, right? I mean, people will go to projects. I mean, that's what happens. I've done this in large rooms of people, and it's what people remember as a memorable learning experience. So you have to find the kinds of questions and topics that will activate people at their own memory of themselves as learners or their own feelings towards, what really interests them. For, people in the room will say, well, it's my quilting. I really love doing my, people, they'll get there. You need to help them activate what they do actually already know about learning, but that they've submerged under all the rules and regulations and all the other stuff that they think they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, we talked, when Larry and I and Adria were involved in this project, we talked about, there were the rules, and then we talked about the rule of thirds, that about a third of the people really wanted to do the new thing. And about a third of them didn't want to do it and were never going to want to do it. And about a third of them were on the fence. They needed to see it before they were going to make a decision. And that's That's okay. That's great. That's the way it is. You need, we all need to see things. So the third did, with the ninth grade, what they wanted to do, the City Works program that Adria talked about. The second third, the middle third, when they saw that and saw the exhibitions and saw kids standing beside their work, proud of it and talking about it, said, I'm in. So that the second year, we could run the 10th grade program because we had enough people in to do the 10th grade program. So that's the way that developed too. It was developed by peers of inviting people in, saying, you know, if you don't want in, that's okay, but we're going ahead and you don't have a veto power on this. And then we were able to move ahead that way. There are lots of possibilities. You try to liberate a little turf, make it okay for some people to do it so others can see it. But I think what Adria says is also very, very important. This is not a conversation about a new technique that we've learned or a new way of approaching teaching and learning. This is a deeper conversation about our kids and about teaching and learning, about what we value in it. What is teaching and learning? And I think it's important to have that conversation about what's going to work best for our kids. And not to say, you can't come in and say, hey, I just learned something that I think we should all do. That's not going to work. But it's more an issue of, less an issue of sharing and more an issue of listening in some ways. And then when you listen, you can figure out where the leverage points are that might give you a little purchase to move forward.
So I just add that part of this is also to change the culture of the school. And that's a leadership piece that a lot of people in the school can do, but that culture shift around what the environment is like is really, really important. There's an assumption made, I'm hearing maybe from you, that everybody in all our schools is operating in the same way and in the same place in their learning as adults. And that's not so either. So that means that the culture has to be one of continuous understanding and getting better and better at what you're doing through your practice. And if you have that conversation and share each other's practice and look at each other in your schools, I think that goes a long way as well. So that culture piece is also very, very important.
Convincing adults over time by influencing is great, but how do we ensure equity of experience for all students when it depends upon which teacher they are assigned, whether they're getting access to high-quality, research-based experiences or lecture? So my question is, how do we ensure equity for the students during this time?
So I think I've changed your question a little bit because I don't think any one teacher can give equity to all students in that way. That you have to look and see where the best fits are. And people have to be open enough to understand that. So if you have your students, you may not be the best person at that time. And you may have to develop those relationships. So you have to have some kind of, once again, culture in your school and ways of working with each and every student. Not everybody's good with everybody at the same time. And these are real serious issues that we have to address in our schools. Maybe somebody from the outside, maybe you learn real differently. Maybe you're an introvert. Maybe you're an extrovert. Maybe you don't like to work on projects. Maybe you like to listen to lectures. Maybe you don't like to listen to lectures. I mean, and those are change at any given time. So you have to be flexible enough to be able to figure that out. And that's a great challenge to have, I think. And the school does.
It's a tough question. If the question's about assignment of teachers and who gets the good teachers and who doesn't, I mean, that's a really knotty question because it involves families as well. and there are families who are good shoppers, and they know, and they have influence, and they can get their kids where they want them, and there are families who don't have that kind of influence. So it's a really, really deep equity issue, and the ways, and there's no magic solution. But working toward a solution involves a couple of things. One is coming to an agreement, or finding some way to come to an agreement about what good teaching is, and coming to an agreement that equity is the issue in our school. Equity is a central issue in our school. Then we can begin to ask questions about, if we agree that equity is an issue, it doesn't matter if we're doing projects or we're doing lectures or whatever, there are certain things that get called into question. For example, questioning behaviors. If I ask you guys a question about, okay, when was James Garfield elected president? Some of you know the answer to that question, and some of you don't. I've asked a factual question, and I've divided the room into those who don't know and those who do. Those who know have standing. Those who don't have standing, and they're not going to want to raise their hand. So you've created an inequitable situation by simply asking a factual question. That's in a lecture situation, it's in a project. So if we can, as a faculty, begin to look at our practice micro around the issue that we've agreed is an equity issue, maybe we can make some traction there too.
I would just add to, I'm going to agree with you rather than give you a conclusion. I feel, even in the 13 schools that we have at High Tech High, and every school I've been part of, and every university I've been part of, including the one we mentioned, any school is as good or as bad as the teacher you have at that moment. So it could be a good school in the morning and a not so good school in the afternoon. Now, we've tried to talk about some of the different ways that you can engage teachers. I have found here, for example, that having public exhibitions of student work, when we have just our new elementary school right here when it opened, in September, and then about 5 weeks later we had the first exhibition. There were probably about, 2,400 parents in there. It was just absolutely, and relatives, it was absolutely jammed. And some teachers were getting a lot of attention, and some people were getting less attention. And the teachers that were getting less attention didn't like getting less attention. And nobody in our organization was beating them up about it. They were, to themselves, in a healthy way, thinking, what is she doing that's so interesting, and what's she doing that's so interesting? Next time, I'm going to do some of what she's doing. I'm going to do some of what she's doing because I want to get some of that attention too. That's something that schools don't have. This whole idea has been mentioned by others of making it public, making it real. That's the best way to make your school an effective school for a larger portion of the day, and it'll still never be all of the day. But that's how I think you grow it.
Another question?
Deal with the parents on that issue.
Okay, when we first started, we get a lot of pushback from parents. We did. And usually, in a way of I don't want to be a hard sell. So with those parents, I would say, well, you're right, we're not for everybody. And maybe since you're unhappy, maybe it's really not a good fit for you. And they would say, well, I can't leave. I said, well, I didn't say you should leave. But since you brought it up, why can't you leave if you don't feel good about it? So, well, my child loves coming so much. So I said, well, I'm sorry about that. So in our case, we decided, coming back to matters of equity, because we began as a high school and worked down, we decided that our four-year college entering rate was going to be the dividing line for us, the defining line for us. And we've done, and you know, if you probably heard our numbers, we're about, I think 67% of our kids here are of color, 46% are free and reduced lunch, whatever. It's a blind lottery that they're accepted, and the rate of kids going into colleges and completing colleges is rather high, extremely high for the population that we have. So I think a lot of parents over time said, well, at first they said, my kid loves coming, and then they said, and colleges love taking them. It's not the way I went to school, but it seems like it's safe. Why not do it?
And what you're talking about, Larry, is mainly, I think, the upper middle class parents, right? And I think that's, you know, those are good strategies for dealing with that population. But there are also real issues for lower income parents and parents of color about trust and trusting in the school and what it will do and can do and wants to do for their children. And that's, I think, a very different strategy. I mean, there's no, you know, like all the questions you all are asking, which are great questions, there is no easy answer to any of these. But the process of building some trust over time that, you know, we are working together, we do together have the, you know, and with the young person in the equation, because they have plenty to say about their own learning as well, we can figure this out. But it can't, you know, as long as the school is an alien environment and one that people don't feel a great sense of trust in, it's, you know, it's not going to be good for the teachers, and it's not going to be good for the students. And it's a very hard thing to build, I think. But it's, you know, and part of it is what Rob said before. If the faculty as a whole can agree on equity as a major issue and hold some values in common and make those values clear to parents, that goes a long way too.
So in our schools, every student has a learning plan. And 4 times a year, there's learning plan meetings where family members come to the meeting. And it's about their child, the student, in the school, around starting with their interests, knowing that there's a content and a curriculum over here. That goes a long way when your voice is at a meeting around your child and you're being heard about the things that you want around your community, your culture, who your child is, what their interests are. That conversation is a beginning, not an ending. That goes on for years and years, that the family is engaged in the school and the child is there. That's long term. Now people know each other, so when something happens, because things do happen in the communities that we're in, they're pretty rough places, and some great things going on as well. And so that role of a family in the school, our data is our parents come to our schools 11 times a year. Public exhibitions and learning plan meetings and some other events. And they know that they're going to be heard if they have a question. These are significant issues in most schools. Parents are afraid, and they're the same parents. But when you invite and engage families to come into the school, and your culture is not one time a year that a parent is going to come in, or they're going to come for a basketball game, or whatever it is, that's a very, very different culture. And so that change is a big deal. That involves programmatic change around learning plan meetings and public exhibitions. It involves getting students out in the community and acknowledging what's important to the community and knowing that the students are going to be out in the community and bringing that learning back into school and vice versa. Because those students are going to be part of the community. When they graduate college, when they graduate high school, they're going to be in the community, they're going to be in the workforce, they're going to be productive citizens. So it's a long-term thing. Stuff happens. People get in trouble. Something happens in a family. All right? These are systems of prevention rather than intervention. And I would argue what we have now is a system of intervention in our regular public school system, not much of a system of prevention. And prevention starts when you invite people in, right from the get-go, and you don't leave and they stay. You're having a continuous conversation.
You invite people in and you go to the homes. I think one of the things that I think is the most important things at High Tech High is that every new student to the school gets a visit from his or her advisor to the home. It makes a difference. You've been in somebody's kitchen in terms of the kinds of conversations you can then have and the kinds of trust that you can build.
So, my question for as a parent and as a teacher too, because I think I'm encountering it in both ways. I happen to live in San Ramon, California. San Ramon, California is, if you look at grade schools, every school is a 9 or a 10. They're doing it the old way. I'm in a school that's doing it with PBL. And, my first concern is that as a parent, I don't want to really subject my students to, my child or my children to schools that are doing it the old way because they're seeing success. There's no reason for them to change. Why change? We still have this high college going rate, right? And I don't really want to, have to take my kids out of the school district, put them into a different school district because this is where my home is where I am. So I guess the question is that how am I as a parent to attack these schools who say there's no reason to change. Everything's fine. We're doing it the right way. You see our college numbers. We see everything. We compare to HTH, and why would we change? That's the big quandary I have as a parent in a school district that's doing it the old way, but having great success.
I can say that I spoke to the principal of a school in Oregon who came to one of our events recently, who described her school in similar terms, saying it's, by all measures, it's one of the best schools in the state. She said for 85% of our students, recognizing that there was some wasn't working for her, but they win athletic championships and most of their kids go on to college. And she said, but I'm here because our students are boring. Boring. Yes, boring and stressed is the other thing she said. They are anxious and they have no interests and they are uninteresting as people. And she's worried about that.
I don't know the school district, but I would ask the question about what measures. And are we looking at real different measures? I think at our schools, we're also looking at other measures aside from an academic measure. And I work with a lot of schools and districts outside of our own because they call us in or they call up High Tech High and they want something from us because they know that their students may be stressed and there's problems in the community. It doesn't matter rich or poor communities or middle class or all different all over the place. There's other measures that are really significant and important around students' interests, their levels of engagement, whether or not they feel anxious or depressed, and what's going on in their lives. And there's nothing that works on a flat line. We all kind of go up and down and change all over the place. So unless the school is really addressing that and changing its culture around that, or waiting for something terrible to happen, God forbid, I would say that you have to still get your parent voice out there and not just speak for your own child because you know a lot about this, but speak for other people's children too in that piece and stand up for it.
I like that idea, looking for allies. I think I was talking with Elliot earlier, he was saying, we know that if people don't want to change, the change isn't going to happen. You have to want to change. So that then raises the question, how do we get people to want to change? What's the trigger? In the school we work with in Chicago, the trigger was that they were going to be disbanded because their test scores were low, and they knew they had to change. In the school that we work with in Iowa, in Muscatine, Iowa, they knew they needed to change because Muscatine is at a bend of the river, the Mississippi River, that has freshwater oysters that produce this nacre. They were the button capital of the world, and they had 30 button factories. And their kids would go to school, and then they'd go to work in the button factory. They now have one button factory. They know they need to change. So the trigger's different in different places. But I love the idea of finding allies. If people in the school don't want to change, if they hear from a lot of parents who want to change, they're going to want to change.
Time for one more question.
I'm curious if you could react to this question, should we get rid of career technical education and just have all classes, all students and all classes integrate career technical education?
Let's hear what you have to say about that.
It depends on what we define as career and technical education. If, you know, yeah, because, yeah, all right. So if we mean by career and technical education that these young people as teenagers are going to be put in a position where they're predicting their future occupation, that's flat out absurd. For 15 years of teaching carpentry, I'm guessing somewhere around 20% of kids ever worked as a carpenter for even a single day after they left. And there's a lot of federal data about that. So that makes no sense. It is unfair to ask anybody of any background to make that prediction. And some kids do know what they want to be, and that's wonderful, right? So then the question is, do we think that schools should be a place where young people get to make things that weren't there before, and to create things, and to publish books, and to build things, and to invent things, and do all the... We got kids here, and I'm sure you do in your schools too, but we got kids here sending ninth graders sending GoPro cameras up 24 miles, right? And taking amazing photographs of galaxies, and then the balloon pops from the lack of pressure up there, and then they're using GPS and driving to Nevada and finding them in the desert. I mean, these kids are like, the fact one night was that night when we had the eclipse, that was the closest, I'm sorry, it was the fullest moon, the biggest full moon since 1983. It was a few months ago, and my wife and I went to the highest point in San Diego to go see it, and that whole ninth grade class was there, and they had actually adjusted somehow this amazing camera to take a picture of the moon, and it was adjusted, and they were all really into it, so that they could take a 2-hour-long shot of the moon, and the camera was moving in a way that you could not see ever so slightly, so that it was adjusting for the movement of the Earth in relationship to the moon, right? So it would be a steady thing. I mean, and they were just all over it. If that's what we mean by career and technical, then I think everybody should have that experience.
I mean, another way to say what Larry just said is if we were going to eliminate career and technical education, we should also eliminate academic education. I mean, the whole thing makes no sense the way we're labeling things right now. So you don't want to take one piece of that away and say, now we've solved a problem, because you won't have solved a problem. You'll have created a whole different problem. So yes, we should probably eliminate both and have something that's very different, more along the lines of what Larry was just describing, that you couldn't put in either box right now, but it has to be in its own kind of new box. But just eliminating, you know, what we now call career and technical education is not going to solve anything, I don't think.
So what we've been accused of is starting with the interests of every child, which is what we do, interests, and continue that on a longitudinal basis. Follow the child's interests. They're going to change. And so what we do, and we've been accused of this, is wrapping a career and technical program around each and every child. Because that's basically what happens biologically and socially to every single one of us. And the schools have to pay attention to where each and every one of our students is going and headed, and not just get them in a pathway that they at times get locked in and at times really want to be in. There has to be that kind of flexibility. So school doesn't have to be career and tech over here and academic over here. As a matter of fact, those are false boundaries anyway. We're just a body. Our bodies can't tell if our minds are doing one thing and our bodies are doing something else with our hands. Hand is mind, language is mind, hand is, it's all the same. And you're in a community. And those kind of factors make a difference in how you, or we, really should have a discussion around what that really means to follow each child's interests and how we can help support that both in and outside of school at the same time so it's productive.
Career and technical ed has to lose itself in order to find itself.
And now you know why Rob is known as Yoda. We're going to close on those wise words. And I'd like to acknowledge before we do that this group is larger than it was this morning, even though it's 5 o'clock, because we've been joined by several of the students from our graduate school and by teachers who were invited to come to hear this panel. And we appreciate you sharing your speakers with that group. I'd like to hear applause now for the members of the panel, but also for the audience that has remained lively for so many hours. Way to go.